Sit back, relax, and welcome to Reading Hours. Today's book is The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers by J.R.R. Tolkien. Please let us know in the comments from where you are watching, or if there is a book you want us to summarize in future. With The Fellowship of the Ring, J.R.R. Tolkien introduced readers to a world on the brink of war, bound together by an ancient evil and a perilous quest. The Two Towers picks up immediately after the Fellowship's breaking, splitting the story into two distinct journeys, one of war and pursuit, and the other of secrecy and sacrifice. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli chase the Uruk Hai who have captured Merry and Pippin, while Frodo and Sam continue their journey toward Mordor, now guided by the treacherous Gollum. This book expands the scale of Middle-earth, revealing the kingdoms of Rohan and Gondor, and introducing legendary characters like King Theoden and the traitorous Saruman. Despite its immense popularity, The Two Towers has faced minor controversies. Some early readers misunderstood its title, believing it referenced the Twin Towers of New York, though Tolkien clarified it was a reference to Orthanc, Saruman's tower, and Barad-dûr, Sauron's stronghold. Additionally, as part of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the book has occasionally faced bans or restrictions, usually due to mistaken concerns over its themes of magic and power. Nevertheless, The Two Towers remains a cornerstone of modern fantasy literature, bringing its characters to their darkest moments while setting the stage for an epic conclusion. Now, let's begin. The Fellowship had broken. The great company that had set out from Rivendell, bound together by oath and purpose, was now scattered across the wilds of Middle-earth. Frodo and Sam had slipped away, carrying the ring toward Mordor alone. Boromir had fallen, slain by orcs while defending Merry and Pippin. And now, on the edge of a darkened forest, Aragorn stood over Boromir's fallen body, grief and duty warring within him. The battle had come upon them swiftly. The Uruk Hai, monstrous orcs bred by Saruman, had attacked in overwhelming numbers, overwhelming Boromir as he desperately defended the two hobbits. Now, Aragorn knelt beside him, watching as the warrior of Gondor took his final breaths. "I tried to take the ring from Frodo," Boromir confessed, pain in his voice. "I have failed you all." But Aragorn did not look at him with anger, only sorrow. He grasped Boromir's hand. "You fought bravely," he said. "You have conquered. Rest now, son of Gondor." With that, Boromir's body grew still, and the world seemed heavier for his loss. There was little time for mourning. The Uruk Hai had taken Merry and Pippin alive, carrying them toward Isengard, Saruman's stronghold. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli prepared Boromir's body, placing him in one of the boats and setting him adrift upon the Anduin. "May the waters bear him to his home," Aragorn whispered, watching as the boat slipped into the current. But even as their fallen companion vanished from sight, a new purpose filled his heart. "We cannot save the ring-bearer," he said to the others, "but we can save Merry and Pippin." And so, the hunt began. They ran like the wind, tracking the Uruk Hai across the fields of Rohan. For days, they followed the trail, covering mile after mile without rest. Legolas, with his keen elven sight, spotted the distant figures of the orcs ahead, but they could not yet catch them. Gimli, though stout and sturdy, grumbled as he ran, but his determination never wavered. And Aragorn, reading the tracks left behind, pieced together what had transpired: the pace of the orcs, the struggles of the hobbits, the movements of their captors. The chase led them into the lands of Rohan, a great kingdom of horse lords ruled by King Theoden. But something was wrong. The land felt uneasy, as if a shadow had crept into its heart. The riders of Rohan, the Rohirrim, were abroad in force, sweeping across the plains with their banners flying. It was not long before Aragorn and his companions were surrounded by them, their leader a tall, proud warrior named Yomer. At first, Yomer was wary of these three strangers wandering his land, especially a dwarf and an elf, ancient enemies in legend. But when Aragorn revealed himself as Isildur's heir and spoke of their quest, Yomer's suspicion turned to urgency. "You seek orcs," he said. "Then I bring you news. We slaughtered a band of Uruk Hai last night, not far from here." Aragorn's heart sank. "And the prisoners, the hobbits?" "We saw none alive," Yomer answered, and a grim silence fell between them. Yet he offered them aid, giving them horses and warning them of the growing darkness in Rohan. Saruman, he revealed, had turned against them. From his tower of Orthanc, he had sent forth armies to spread ruin upon Rohan. Worse still, he had ensnared King Theoden's mind, twisting him with poison words until he was but a shadow of himself. The kingdom teetered on the brink of destruction. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli rode hard to the site of the battle, searching for any sign of their friends. The ground was strewn with the bodies of slain orcs, the air thick with the stench of death. But of Merry and Pippin, there was no sign. Had they been taken elsewhere? Had they perished unnoticed? As they scoured the battlefield, Aragorn's keen eyes spotted something, a faint trail leading into the nearby Fangorn forest, a place of ancient mystery and whispered fears. "They went this way," he said, determination flaring in his voice. "They are not dead." Little did they know, the hobbits had indeed escaped. Merry and Pippin had suffered greatly in their captivity. The Uruk Hai, cruel and relentless, had driven them forward without rest, snarling at them like beasts. The hobbits had been caught in a brutal struggle between different factions of orcs, some serving Saruman, others loyal to Sauron. There had been dissent in the ranks, confusion and bloodshed in the night. And in that chaos, they had slipped away, crawling desperately into the darkness of Fangorn. The forest was unlike anything they had ever known. It was old, impossibly old, with towering trees that seemed to watch them. The air was thick and heavy, filled with strange sounds. The hobbits stumbled onward, exhausted and afraid. But they were not alone. Something was moving in the depths of Fangorn, something ancient and slow, with eyes deep as wells. It was Treebeard, the eldest of the Ents, a shepherd of the forest. He was massive, like a walking tree, with gnarled limbs and a voice like rustling leaves. He gazed down at the hobbits with curiosity, as if deciding whether they were friend or foe. "Whom hum," he rumbled at last. "Little folk wandering in my woods. Strange times indeed." Merry and Pippin, despite their fear, quickly realized that Treebeard was no enemy. The old Ent listened to their tale, nodding solemnly as they spoke of Saruman and the orcs. His face darkened. "Saruman," he muttered, his voice like deep earth shifting. "A betrayer of our old ways. He has hewn my kin, burned my forests. This cannot stand." For centuries, the Ents had been silent, watching the world change around them. But now, for the first time in an age, something stirred in their hearts. Anger, resolve. A slow, growing fury, like roots breaking stone. Treebeard called an Entmoot, a great gathering of the Ents. From all corners of Fangorn, the shepherds of the trees came, ancient beings who spoke in slow, measured tones. The debate lasted long, for the Ents were creatures of patience. But at last, they reached a decision. Saruman had gone too far. It was time for the trees to march to war. And so, the wheels of fate began to turn. While Aragorn and his companions searched, and while Rohan stood on the brink of ruin, the Ents prepared to unleash their wrath. The war for Middle-earth was beginning in earnest. The story of the two towers had only just begun. The sun had barely risen over the plains of Rohan when Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli stepped into the shadow of Fangorn Forest. The tangled branches stretched high, their thick canopy swallowing the light, casting the forest floor in eerie gloom. This was no ordinary woodland. It was ancient, filled with whispers of things long past, and the weight of unseen eyes pressing upon them. Even Legolas, an elf who understood the language of trees, felt uneasy. "There is a great power here," he murmured, "something older than any of us." Aragorn bent low, studying the faint signs on the ground. "The hobbits came this way," he said, his voice resolute. "They are alive." But as they pushed forward, they had no way of knowing that Merry and Pippin had already found refuge in the care of Treebeard, the shepherd of the forest. Meanwhile, deep within Fangorn, the Entmoot had begun. Treebeard had gathered the Ents, tall, gnarled beings with skin like bark and voices like the rustling wind, to discuss the growing shadow of Saruman. It was a slow deliberation, as Ents did not rush decisions. They spoke in long, drawn-out syllables, considering every angle with the patience of creatures who had lived for thousands of years. Merry and Pippin could do little but wait as the great gathering murmured and debated. Back at the forest's edge, Aragorn and his companions pressed onward, moving cautiously through the undergrowth. They had no warning before the figure stepped before them, a man cloaked in gray, his presence commanding, his face hidden beneath a hood. Immediately they went for their weapons. Legolas drew his bow, Gimli raised his axe, Aragorn gripped his sword. "Who are you?" Aragorn demanded. The stranger lifted his head, revealing piercing eyes that gleamed with wisdom and power. Then, with a simple gesture, he threw back his hood, and the three travelers gasped in astonishment. Before them stood Gandalf, not in the gray robes they had known him by, but clad in white, his very presence radiant. They had believed him lost in the depths of Moria, falling into the abyss with the Balrog. But Gandalf had returned, transformed, his spirit reforged in fire and light. "I am Gandalf the White," he told them, "and I have come back to you at the turn of the tide." He had battled the Balrog, descending into darkness before rising again, his power renewed. There was little time for awe, however. Saruman's schemes had already set terrible events into motion. Rohan was in peril. The king was under a spell. War was coming. Realizing their quest had shifted, the company turned their attention toward Edoras, the capital of Rohan. If King Theoden could be freed from Saruman's influence, Rohan might yet stand against the darkness. Leaving behind the mysteries of Fangorn, they rode swiftly across the plains, arriving at the Golden Hall of Meduseld. But as they approached, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. The guards were wary, their faces grim. Rohan's people looked hollow-eyed, worn down by fear. And within the great hall itself, seated upon his throne, King Theoden was barely more than a shadow of a man. His face was lined, his hair gray, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world had broken him. By his side sat Grima Wormtongue, his advisor, pale, slithering, whispering into the king's ear. It was clear he was no true counselor, but an agent of Saruman, feeding the king with poison words, keeping him weak and fearful. Gandalf wasted no time. Striding forward, he cast aside his cloak and raised his staff, his voice ringing through the hall. "Too long have you sat in darkness, Theoden of Rohan," he declared. At once, Wormtongue recoiled, his face twisting in alarm. "Do not listen to him, my lord," he pleaded. He seeks to deceive you." But the spell was already breaking. With a command of sheer will, Gandalf called upon his power, driving Saruman's influence from Theoden's mind. The king shuddered, gasping as if waking from a long nightmare. His eyes cleared, his strength returned, and in that moment, Rohan had its king back. Fury burned in Theoden's eyes as he looked upon Wormtongue. The false counselor pleaded for mercy, but his treachery had been exposed. "Begone from my sight," Theoden ordered. "Let him crawl back to his master if he can." With that, Wormtongue was cast out, fleeing Meduseld in disgrace. Now freed from Saruman's grip, Theoden did not hesitate. War was upon them, and Rohan could not stand idle. He called upon his riders, commanding them to prepare for battle. They would not wait for Saruman's armies to come and slaughter them in their homes. They would make their stand at Helm's Deep, the ancient stronghold nestled in the mountains. Meanwhile, Gandalf had his own task to complete. "There is one I must seek," he told Aragorn before departing. "Look for me on the 5th day." With that, he rode off into the wilds, his purpose known only to himself. As the people of Rohan prepared for their desperate march to Helm's Deep, the war in Middle-earth was escalating. Saruman's forces were already on the move. In the dark forges of Isengard, legions of Uruk-hai were being bred, their weapons sharpened, their armor gleaming. Thousands upon thousands marched, an unstoppable tide of destruction. The Battle of Helm's Deep was coming, and the fate of Rohan would soon be decided. Meanwhile, deep within Fangorn, the Entmoot had reached its decision. The slow deliberation had ended. The Ents, once passive guardians of the forest, had been stirred to wrath. The trees would march to war. Led by Treebeard, they turned toward Isengard, their roots shaking the earth as they moved. Saruman, in his arrogance, had believed the Ents were no threat. He had forgotten that the oldest powers in Middle-earth were not easily dismissed. As Theoden's people rode for the stronghold, and as the Ents marched toward their vengeance, the story of the two towers pressed forward toward its most pivotal battles. The forces of darkness were moving, but the defenders of Middle-earth would not stand idle. The war had begun. The riders of Rohan rode swiftly across the plains, a long column of warriors, women, and children making their way toward Helm's Deep, their last refuge against the coming storm. The sound of hooves pounded against the earth, but there was little talk among them. Fear weighed heavily upon their hearts. Theoden, now restored to his strength, rode at their head, grim-faced as he looked upon the horizon, knowing what lay ahead. Beside him rode Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, their thoughts troubled. The shadow of war was growing ever closer, and they all felt the urgency of the moment. The land of Rohan was vast, but it no longer felt safe. Everywhere, the mark of Saruman's treachery could be seen: villages burned, fields left in ruin, signs of orc raiding parties cutting through the land. Aragorn could see it plainly. Rohan was on the brink of destruction. Helm's Deep was their only hope, but even that great fortress had never been tested against such an enemy as this. As they traveled, Eowyn, the niece of King Theoden, rode among them. She was strong and proud, but there was sorrow in her eyes. She had watched her people suffer, and now she was being sent away with the refugees while the men prepared to fight. Though she longed to take up a sword and stand beside them, Theoden forbade it. "This is not your battle," he told her. But Aragorn saw the fire in her heart. She was no helpless maiden. She was a shield maiden of Rohan, a warrior in spirit if not in name. Even as they rode, time was slipping away. Scouts reported that Saruman's army was on the move, 10,000 Uruk high, marching toward them with a singular purpose: to wipe Rohan from the face of Middle-earth. Theoden quickened the pace, urging his people forward, knowing that they had only hours before the enemy would be upon them. By nightfall, they reached Helm's Deep, an ancient stronghold built into the mountains, its towering walls standing tall against the darkened sky. It was a place of legend, where the people of Rohan had taken refuge in times of great peril. But now, as the people poured into its gates, there was little comfort to be found. There were too few warriors, too many untrained men and boys, and no reinforcements in sight. "How can we stand against such numbers?" some whispered, but Theoden refused to surrender. "We will fight," he declared, "and we will not be defeated." Aragorn moved among the people, rallying them as best he could. He saw farmers clutching rusted swords, boys who had never seen battle standing in line with fear in their eyes. "Courage," he told them. "You are not alone." Yet even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at his mind. This was not an army, it was a last stand. They needed help, but there was none to be found. As the defenders prepared, Legolas and Gimli stood together on the walls, surveying the battlefield. Legolas, keen-eyed, could see torches flickering in the far distance, the first signs of the approaching army. "They come," he said grimly. Gimli tightened his grip on his axe. "Good," he growled. "I was beginning to think I'd have no sport tonight." But Aragorn was restless. He did not fear battle, but something troubled him. The people needed hope, but Theoden was resigned to death. "We cannot win this fight," the king murmured to himself, staring at the night sky. "What can men do against such reckless hate?" Aragorn placed a hand on his shoulder. "We fight," he said simply. The night deepened, and the storm broke. A cold rain fell as the Uruk Hai arrived, their black banners waving in the wind. From the walls, the defenders could see the sheer scale of the enemy, row upon row of armored orcs, their weapons gleaming, their voices raised in a terrible war cry. They carried great siege ladders, battering rams, and strange explosive devices crafted by Saruman himself. Then, with a deafening roar, the battle began. The first wave of Uruk Hai surged forward, their shields raised as arrows rained down from the walls. Legolas and the archers struck true, but the Uruks were relentless, shrugging off their losses and pushing forward. Siege ladders slammed against the walls, and soon the fighting was hand to hand. Aragorn led the charge, cutting through the enemy with swift, precise strikes. Gimli, despite his shorter stature, fought ferociously, hacking down foes with every swing of his axe. 17, he called out, counting each kill. 19, Legolas replied, loosing arrow after arrow. The two friends fought side by side, turning the slaughter into a contest, but they both knew this was no game. Below, the gates shuddered as the battering rams struck again and again. Theoden's men braced for impact, but the enemy was too strong. With a thunderous explosion, the wall was breached. Saruman's devices had done their work. Uruk Hai poured through, overwhelming the defenders. The line was breaking. Aragorn called for a retreat, rallying the remaining men to the keep. They fell back step by step, fighting for every inch. Theoden, his sword slick with blood, stood firm. "Hold the keep," he shouted, his voice defiant. But the Uruks pressed on, their numbers endless. And then, just as all hope seemed lost, a horn rang out over the battlefield. It was deep and powerful, echoing through the valley, the sound of the Rohirrim. Aragorn's heart leapt. He turned toward the ridge, where against the rising sun a lone rider stood, a figure in white, shining like a beacon. Gandalf had returned. And behind him, charging down the slope, came the riders of Rohan, led by Eomer himself. With a mighty cry, the Rohirrim crashed into the enemy's flank, their charge unstoppable. The Uruk-hai, taken by surprise, faltered. Their ranks broke, and suddenly the tide had turned. The defenders of Helm's Deep, once surrounded, now fought with renewed strength, driving back their foes. The sun rose higher, illuminating the battlefield in golden light. Saruman's army, once so certain of victory, was now in full retreat. And then the final blow. The trees had come. The very forest had moved, creeping forward in the night, surrounding the fleeing Uruks. These were the Huorns, ancient beings of Fangorn, moving with the wrath of the Ents. The orcs ran screaming into the dark woods and were never seen again. The battle was won. Helm's Deep had held, but the war was far from over. As Theoden surveyed the battlefield, he knew that this was only the beginning. Saruman had been defeated here, but his master still remained. Sauron's gaze was upon them now, and his power was greater than any they had faced before. And far away, in the shadowed lands of Mordor, Frodo and Sam continued their own perilous journey, carrying the fate of the world on their shoulders. Far from the battlefields of Helm's Deep, across the barren, twisted lands of Mordor's border, Frodo and Sam trudged onward, each step bringing them closer to the heart of darkness. The burden of the ring grew heavier with every mile, and Frodo's strength was waning. The land itself seemed to resist them, barren hills, jagged rocks, and endless expanses of lifeless, gray waste stretched in every direction. Water was scarce, and the air grew thick with the distant fumes of Mount Doom. Yet they were not alone. Gollum, the wretched creature who had followed them from the Amin Mule, now slithered ahead as their guide. Sam did not trust him. He saw the gleam of malice in Gollum's pale eyes, the twitch of his fingers as if he longed to reclaim the ring. But Frodo, weary and weighed down, saw something else. He saw a creature who had once been like him, twisted by the very thing he now carried. Against Sam's protests, Frodo treated Gollum with a strange kindness, binding him with words rather than ropes, making him swear an oath. Gollum led them through the dead marshes, a landscape of horror where the land had swallowed the bodies of an ancient battle. Ghostly faces lay beneath the water, flickering with eerie light, their vacant eyes staring upward. "Don't follow the lights," Gollum whispered, his voice tight with fear. "They'll lead you astray." Sam gripped Frodo's arm as the ring-bearer seemed drawn toward the haunting reflections, his mind slipping into the strange pull of the world around him. Only Gollum's urgent tug brought him back to reality. Days passed in torment, the journey taking its toll. Frodo's hand never strayed far from the ring, his fingers brushing its surface as if drawn to its touch. Sam watched, troubled. The closer they came to Mordor, the more Frodo changed. Shadows gathered beneath his eyes, his steps grew slower, and his voice wavered with exhaustion. The ring was consuming him. As they moved ever eastward, they soon found themselves in a new peril. A great road stretched before them, leading directly to the Black Gate of Mordor, the entrance to Sauron's land, a place of towering walls, spiked battlements, and endless lines of marching orcs. The sight of it stole the breath from their lungs. Even Gollum cowered. "We cannot go this way," he hissed, shaking his head violently. "The gate is watched day and night. The eye is always looking." Frodo, desperate, argued that they must. They had no other path. But Gollum, wringing his hands, spoke of another way, a secret way. A passage through the mountains, unknown to the orcs, a path only he knew. His voice slithered with eagerness as he pleaded with Frodo to trust him. Sam did not like it. Every word sounded like a trap, but Frodo, exhausted and with no better choice, agreed. They turned southward, skirting the edges of Mordor, traveling by night to avoid patrols. The land grew wilder, the hills steeper. It was here, on the fringes of the Dark Land, that they encountered a band of men, tall and grim-faced, garbed in strange armor. These were the Southrons, men who had come from distant lands to fight for Sauron. Among them was one not so different from Frodo, small, weary, bound in chains. A prisoner. Before Frodo could even understand what was happening, an ambush erupted. Arrows flew, swords clashed. From the shadows, rangers struck, their green cloaks blending into the wild. The men of Gondor had come. Faramir, the captain of Gondor and brother of Boromir, led the attack. In swift, deadly movements, his men overpowered the enemy, driving them into retreat. When the battle ended, he turned his piercing gaze upon Frodo and Sam. He had seen many strange things in war, but two small hobbits wandering near Mordor was beyond reason. His men seized them, and they were brought to the hidden refuge of Heneth-Anun, a sanctuary nestled in the cliffs behind a rushing waterfall. Frodo, exhausted and wary, met Faramir's questioning with caution. He knew this man was Boromir's brother, and he feared what that might mean. If Boromir had fallen to the ring's temptation, would his brother be the same? But Faramir was not his brother. Where Boromir had been proud and desperate, Faramir was measured and wise. He spoke of Gondor's struggles, of his father, Denethor, who ruled Minas Tirith with a bitter heart. He spoke of the weight of duty and the coming war. Then, the moment of truth came. Faramir learned of the ring. Sam, in frustration, let slip what Frodo carried, the terrible burden that had driven Boromir to madness. Silence filled the chamber. Faramir stared at them, his face unreadable. Then, at last, he spoke. "I would not take this thing if it lay by the highway," he said, "nor in exchange for the power of Minas Tirith." Unlike his brother, he did not see the ring as a weapon to be used, but as a curse that must be destroyed. Frodo, for the first time in many days, felt a flicker of hope. There were still men in this world who understood the true nature of the ring. Faramir released them, giving them provisions for their journey. But he also gave them a warning: Gollum could not be trusted. He had seen the hunger in the creature's eyes, the deceit in his voice. "Take care," he said. "There are some paths no man or hobbit should tread." But Frodo had made his choice. They would follow Gollum. They would take the secret path. And so, under the cover of night, they left Heneth-Anun, making their way toward the jagged peaks of Cirith Ungol, where danger lay in wait. The road ahead grew darker as Frodo and Sam followed Gollum southward, leaving the safety of Faramir's refuge behind. The air became thick with a foul stench, and the land turned harsh and unforgiving. Jagged rocks and steep cliffs blocking their way at every turn. Gollum moved with an unnatural ease, slinking through the shadows, always whispering of the secret path that would lead them into Mordor unseen. Sam remained suspicious. He saw the way Gollum looked at Frodo when he thought no one was watching, the gleam of hunger, the flicker of something dangerous in his pale, sunken eyes. The creature spoke to himself in hushed tones, his divided mind at war. At times, he seemed almost pitiful, talking in a childlike voice about poor Smeagol, longing for the days before the ring had ruined him. But at other times, darker thoughts took hold, and the name Gollum suited him well. Frodo, though exhausted, continued to show kindness to their guide. He understood the pull of the ring, the way it had twisted Gollum beyond recognition. In some way, he saw his own fate reflected in the creature, what he, too, might become if he failed to resist. "You swore to serve the master of the precious," Frodo reminded Gollum whenever doubt crept into his voice. And each time, Gollum bowed and nodded, hissing, "Yes, yes, Smeagol is faithful." But even as they pressed on, a shadow followed them. A new danger lurked nearby. Strange noises echoed across the cliffs at night, a sense of watchful, unseen eyes weighing down on them. Something else was out there in the dark. After days of treacherous travel, Gollum led them into a narrow ravine, hidden between the steep cliffs of the Ephel-Jueth, the mountains that formed the western border of Mordor. The path wound upward, becoming steeper with every step. A terrible smell filled the air, the stench of decay and rot. "We must go this way," Gollum insisted. Up to the tunnel, then down into the land of shadows." Sam hesitated. Everything about this place felt wrong. He could hear something faint and distant, a sound like soft, rustling movement in the dark. "What's in this tunnel, then?" he demanded. "What's waiting for us?" But Gollum only shook his head, his grin stretched too wide. "Only a little tunnel, a little secret way. No orcs, no men, just a path." Frodo, weak and desperate, did not argue. The ring was crushing him, his strength failing with each passing hour. He could barely lift his sword, barely think beyond the overwhelming weight of his burden. He had no choice but to follow. The entrance to the tunnel yawned before them, a gaping maw in the mountainside. A deep blackness stretched beyond, swallowing all light. The air that flowed from within was heavy with the scent of death, thick and choking. Sam tightened his grip on his sword, his every instinct screaming at him to turn back. Then Gollum disappeared. One moment he was slinking ahead, the next he was gone. His voice, usually full of nervous chatter, had gone silent. Sam cursed. "He's led us into a trap." And then it came. A sound, wet and slick, like something vast moving in the darkness. A foul hiss echoed through the tunnel, followed by the clicking of many legs. A shape moved in the shadows, massive and bloated, creeping down the walls like a nightmare-given form. Shelob. The great spider had dwelled here for an age, a remnant of a world long before Sauron. She had no allegiance to him, no master but her own endless hunger. Orcs feared her, avoiding the tunnel unless absolutely necessary. But Gollum knew her well. He had made a pact with her long ago, luring prey into her lair in exchange for his own miserable life. Sam barely had time to shout before Shelob struck. A monstrous black leg slashed through the air, barely missing Frodo as he stumbled backward. Her great, bloated body filled the tunnel, her multiple eyes gleaming with a sickly green light. The stench of her breath filled the space as she lunged. Frodo ran, his heart pounding, but Shelob was faster. The tunnel twisted and turned, her long legs closing the distance. She was toying with him, savoring his fear. He fumbled for the phial of Galadriel, the gift given to him by the Lady of Lorien, and held it high. A sudden, pure light erupted from the small crystal, white and searing against the darkness. Shelob shrieked, rearing back, her many eyes blinded by its glow. The light of Eärendil's star, captured in the glass, burned through the shadows, forcing her to retreat. Sam reached Frodo's side, slashing wildly with his sword, trying to drive the beast back. "Run, Mr. Frodo," he yelled. "I'll hold her off." But Frodo did not run. He turned, and for the first time in his life, he struck with all the strength he had left. Sting, his small elvish blade, flashed in the dim light, slicing into Shelob's leg. The great spider howled in rage. Then, in one swift, terrible moment, she struck. Her stinger lashed out, sinking into Frodo's neck. He gasped, his body convulsing as venom coursed through his veins. His sword slipped from his grasp. The light of the file dimmed as it fell to the ground. And then silence. Frodo lay still. Sam stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. His master, his friend, was dead. Shelob, satisfied with her kill, dragged Frodo's limp body deeper into the tunnel, wrapping him in thick cords of webbing, preparing to feast. But Sam was not done. Rage surged through him, a fire unlike anything he had ever felt before. He raised his sword and charged. Shelob, caught off guard, did not expect an attack. Sam ducked beneath her legs, dodging her strikes, slashing at her swollen body. He struck hard, driving Sting into the soft flesh beneath her. The blade cut deep, black blood gushing from the wound. Shelob screamed, a horrible, keening sound that echoed through the tunnel. She fled, dragging herself back into the darkness, her massive form retreating into the depths of her lair. Sam did not chase her. He had no time for vengeance. He turned to Frodo, slicing through the thick webs that bound him. He shook him, called his name. No response. Frodo's body was cold, his face pale, his breathing absent. Sam's chest tightened with grief. He had failed. The burden of the ring was now his alone. But before he could decide what to do, the sound of marching feet echoed through the tunnel. Orcs. A patrol was approaching. Sam barely had time to react before they were upon him. He ducked into the shadows as the orcs gathered around Frodo's body. "What's this?" one of them sneered. "Not dead, just paralyzed. Shelob's poison works slow." Sam's breath caught. Frodo was alive. But before he could act, the orcs hoisted Frodo's body onto their shoulders. "Take him to the tower," one of them ordered. "The master will want to see this one." And with that, they carried Frodo away into the fortress of Cirith Ungol, the threshold of Mordor itself. Sam stood frozen in the dark tunnel, his heart pounding as the orcs carried Frodo away. The truth hit him like a blow. Frodo was alive. The orcs had said so. Shelob's venom had only paralyzed him, leaving him helpless but breathing. Sam's grief was replaced by a fierce determination. He had no choice now. He had to follow. He had to save Frodo. The orcs marched through a narrow path that wound up into the cliffs, leading toward the looming fortress of Cirith Ungol. Sam followed at a distance, careful to stay hidden. He had no plan, no strategy, only a desperate need to reach Frodo before it was too late. The Black Land was no place for a hobbit, yet here he was, stepping deeper into the enemy's domain. The fortress of Cirith Ungol was an ancient tower, built long ago as a watchpost by Gondor. But now it had fallen into Sauron's grasp. Its walls were tall and cruel, its gates thick and iron-bound. It loomed against the sky, its highest turrets lost in the swirling gloom. Sam crouched in the shadows outside, watching as the orcs disappeared through the main entrance, carrying Frodo inside. The heavy doors slammed shut behind them, and Sam was left outside with no clear way in. Panic threatened to consume him, but he forced himself to think. He had Sting at his side, the phial of Galadriel in his pocket. But he was just one hobbit, and beyond that gate was an entire fortress of orcs. Then, from the walls above, he heard voices, loud, angry, arguing. The orcs inside were fighting among themselves, Sam crept closer, listening. "We found him first," one voice snarled. "Our orders were clear: strip him, search him, and report to the captain." "We know what the big boss will want," another barked. "He'll want to know what this little rat was doing sneaking into Mordor. Maybe he's a spy. Maybe he's got something valuable." Sam clenched his fists. They were searching Frodo. That meant they would find the ring. A terrible fear gripped him. If an orc so much as touched it, would they be consumed? Would Sauron himself feel it, know exactly where they were? The thought was unbearable. He had to act. Then an idea struck him. It was reckless, foolish, but it might just work. He stood up straight, puffed out his chest, and marched toward the gate. He had remembered something from stories of great heroes. Sometimes, the boldest lies were the most effective. He banged his sword against the metal door and shouted in the roughest, deepest voice he could manage. "Oi, open up, you maggots. I've got orders from Lugbers. Let me in." For a brief moment, there was silence. Then a confused orc peered over the wall. "What?" Sam did not hesitate. "You deaf? I said I've got orders from the Eye itself. Let me in, or I'll have your heads on pikes." The orc hesitated. Sam's small size should have given him away instantly, but orcs were dim-witted and suspicious of each other. The fortress was already in chaos from their infighting. Before the orc could properly question him, another voice from inside bellowed, "Open the gate, you fools." With a loud creak, the doors parted slightly, and Sam darted inside before they could change their minds. The fortress was a nightmare of stone and iron, dimly lit by flickering torches. Narrow corridors twisted in every direction, and everywhere, orcs moved about, growling, arguing, pushing each other. The place stank of sweat and filth, and Sam had to force himself not to gag. He slipped through the chaos, keeping to the shadows, moving toward the sound of the argument he had heard earlier. As he crept closer, he heard something that made his blood run cold. "The little rat's got nothing," one orc snarled. "No weapons, no food, but he had this." Sam peeked through a crack in the door. The orc held up Frodo's mithril shirt, a beautiful, shining coat of silver that gleamed even in the dim light. The sight of it drove the orcs into a frenzy. "Valuable, that is," another orc growled. "Worth more than you stinking maggot. The big boss will want this. They'll kill us all if we don't report it," another spat. The orcs turned on each other, their greed getting the better of them. Before Sam could even act, they were at each other's throats. Swords flashed, voices roared, and within moments, the room erupted into violence. Sam took his chance. He darted past the fighting orcs, slipping through the shadows toward the far side of the chamber. And there, lying on the cold stone floor, was Frodo. His face was pale, his body motionless, wrapped in torn rags. His chest barely rose and fell. He was alive, but weak. Sam rushed to his side. "Mr. Frodo," he whispered urgently, shaking him. Frodo groaned, his eyes fluttering open. Confusion filled his face as he looked up at Sam. "Sam," he murmured weakly. I thought I was dead." "Not yet," Sam said fiercely. "But we have to move. Now." He pulled Frodo to his feet, supporting him as they stumbled out of the chamber. The orcs were still fighting among themselves, too consumed by their own quarrel to notice the hobbits slipping away. Sam led Frodo through the winding corridors, down the stairs, toward the lower levels of the tower. But just as they reached the final passage leading to the outer gate, a great horn sounded. The fighting orcs had finally realized their prisoner was gone. A roar of anger filled the fortress. Heavy boots thundered toward them. Sam shoved Frodo forward. "Run!" They sprinted down the last stretch of the corridor, the heavy doors of the tower just ahead. Sam grabbed a fallen orc's sword and swung at the lock, breaking it open. The doors groaned as they swung outward, revealing the dark, empty land beyond. The hobbits dashed outside, barely escaping before the orcs reached the doors. As soon as they stepped beyond the threshold, the tower doors slammed shut behind them, locking the furious orcs inside. Panting, shaking, Frodo turned to Sam. "You saved me," he whispered. Sam looked at him, his face pale but determined. "That's what I'm here for, Mr. Frodo." The fortress of Cirith Ungol loomed behind them, but ahead lay the final stretch of their journey. Mordor awaited. Frodo and Sam stood outside the gates of Cirith Ungol, their bodies weak, their breaths ragged. Behind them, the fortress still echoed with the furious cries of orcs. But they had done the impossible. They had escaped. Yet their journey was far from over. Ahead of them stretched the dark land of Mordor, a barren wasteland of ash and rock, where the very air seemed to sap strength from their limbs. The fires of Mount Doom flickered in the far distance, a grim reminder of their terrible purpose. Frodo staggered, still weak from Shelob's venom and the torment of captivity. Sam caught him before he could fall, steadying him with one arm. "We have to keep going, Mr. Frodo," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "We can't stop now." Frodo nodded weakly, but the weight of the ring pressed down on him heavier than ever. He could feel its pull, stronger now that they were so close to its master's domain. Every step forward felt like walking through a storm, his thoughts clouded by whispers, his very willpower eroding. The land before them was a desolation of black stone and twisted hills, with deep cracks running through the scorched earth. The sky was a thick, choking gray, a perpetual twilight filled with fumes and drifting ash. Sam pulled out their last remaining bits of food, crumbling pieces of Lemba's bread. They had almost nothing left. The air grew hotter as they walked, each mile a slow and agonizing march. Sam tried to keep Frodo talking, to keep him from sinking too deeply into the dark thoughts that seemed to take hold of him more and more often. "Do you remember the Shire, Mr. Frodo?" Sam said. "The taste of strawberries and cream, the feel of grass under your feet." Frodo's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile, but he said nothing. The ring had taken hold of his mind so completely that even memories of home felt distant and unreal. As they crept through the broken landscape, they realized something terrible. Mordor was not empty. The land was alive with movement. Armies of Sauron's forces marched through the land, thousands of orcs and trolls moving in great columns toward the Black Gate. Drums echoed in the distance, and banners bearing the lidless eye flapped in the hot winds. The entire land was preparing for war. Sam's heart sank. How could they possibly cross this place unseen? They crept through the crags and ditches, hiding behind jagged rocks whenever patrols passed too close. Every moment was filled with fear. More than once, they saw great winged shapes circling the skies above Nazgul, gliding silently on their fell beasts, searching for intruders. Frodo shuddered whenever they drew near, clutching at the ring as if it burned him. Days passed in a blur of exhaustion and hunger. Water was scarce, and their strength was failing. Frodo could barely walk on his own, and Sam took to supporting him more and more. But no matter how hopeless it seemed, Sam refused to give up. "We'll get there, Mr. Frodo," he whispered again and again. "We'll finish what we started." Then one night, as they crouched beneath the shelter of a broken ridge, they heard something footsteps. A soft, slinking sound. Sam grabbed Frodo's arm, his heart pounding. "Something's coming," he hissed. Out of the shadows crawled a thin, bent figure, moving on all fours. "Gollum." Sam leaped to his feet, drawing Sting. "You," he snarled. "You led us into that trap. You left him for dead." Gollum flinched, but his wide, pale eyes fixed on Frodo, filled with something close to longing. "Master," he whined. "Master is alive. We are so glad, yes, yes. But poor Smeagol is hungry, so very hungry." Frodo, against all reason, looked at him with pity. "Why are you here, Gollum?" he asked softly. Gollum wrung his hands, shifting nervously. "Smeagol followed, yes, yes. Through the tunnels, through the dark places. The orcs did not see us, no. Clever we are." Sam tightened his grip on his sword. "Why?" Gollum's lips twisted into a strange smile. "Smeagol can help. Yes, yes. He knows the way, knows the paths through the dark, knows how to hide. Master needs Smeagol." Sam did not trust him, not for a second. But Frodo was barely standing, and they had no idea how to cross this cursed land unseen. He turned to Frodo, waiting for his answer. Frodo studied Gollum for a long moment. He saw the desperation, the hunger, the torment that clung to him. And he knew, deep in his heart, that he and Gollum were not so different. They were both bound to the ring, trapped in its web. Perhaps, without help, Frodo himself would become just like him. "Very well," Frodo said at last. "But no more tricks, Gollum." Gollum grinned, his sharp teeth gleaming. "No tricks. No, we serve the master of the precious." Sam scowled but said nothing. He would be watching Gollum every step of the way. Gollum led them on, guiding them through hidden paths and rocky crevices. They avoided the great roads where orc armies marched, and instead wove through the dark, unseen places of Mordor. But every step brought them closer to their goal, and closer to the heart of Sauron's power. At last, they reached a high ridge overlooking the vast plain of Gorgoroth. There, in the distance, stood Mount Doom, a great, fiery mountain spewing ash and smoke into the sky. The sight of it sent a shiver down Frodo's spine. That was where it would end. But even as they took in the terrible sight, Gollum turned, his eyes flashing with something dark. His fingers twitched, his breathing grew rapid. And Sam knew in that moment that Gollum was waiting for his chance. The old hunger was returning. The ring was too close now. Gollum was planning to betray them again. And soon, the final struggle would begin. Frodo, Sam, and Gollum crouched behind a jagged ridge, staring across the vast wasteland of Mordor. The distant glow of Mount Doom flickered against the heavy sky, a beacon of fire that called to the ring, pulling at Frodo's mind with every step closer. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur and ash, and the ground beneath them was hard and cracked, the very land poisoned by the Dark Lord's presence. Gollum, shifting on his haunches, pointed ahead with his long, bony finger. "This way, yes, yes. We must be careful, must be quiet. The eye watches, oh yes, always watches." His voice was little more than a whisper, but there was a frantic urgency to it, an edge that made Sam grip the hilt of his sword. He didn't trust Gollum, not after all they had been through. And he knew, deep in his heart, that Gollum's obsession with the ring had only grown stronger. Frodo, exhausted beyond words, merely nodded. He had little strength left to argue or question. Each step felt heavier, the weight of the ring an unbearable burden pressing against his chest. His thoughts were clouded, his limbs weak, and he hardly noticed when Sam moved beside him, gently guiding him forward. They crept down the ridge, slipping into the shadows, staying low as they navigated the broken landscape. Mordor was alive with movement, orc patrols, marching armies, and the distant cries of fell beasts echoing through the air. The great war machine of Sauron was in full motion, and they were ants in its path, desperate not to be crushed. Gollum led them along hidden trails, winding through deep crevices and behind sharp outcroppings of black rock. At times, they had to crawl, pressing themselves against the ground to avoid passing bands of orcs. Once, they froze as a Nazgul passed overhead, its shadow gliding over them like a terrible omen. Frodo clutched the ring, his breath catching in his throat, feeling the terrible pull of the Wraith's presence. Sam put a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time had lost all meaning. Hunger gnawed at them, thirst burned in their throats. Their supplies were almost gone. Only a few crumbling pieces of lembas remained, and even those tasted like dust in their mouths. Then, one night, as they rested in a small crevice between two towering stones, Gollum's demeanor began to change. He became more restless, his movements twitchy and anxious. He muttered to himself more than usual, whispering things under his breath that neither Frodo nor Sam could understand. Sam narrowed his eyes, watching Gollum carefully. "He's up to something," he murmured. Frodo, barely able to keep his eyes open, simply sighed. "We need him, Sam." Sam frowned but said nothing. Later, as Frodo dozed, Sam woke to the sound of soft footsteps. He blinked, reaching for his sword, and saw Gollum crouched nearby, staring at Frodo with an eerie intensity. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, and his fingers twitched as if he were debating something. Sam's breath caught in his throat. He knew, with a sick certainty, that Gollum was about to act. "Get away from him, you sneaking rat," Sam hissed, leaping up. Gollum recoiled, hissing in return, his lips pulling back to reveal his sharp teeth. "Smeagol only watches." "Smeagol means no harm, no." Sam wasn't convinced. "You were about to take the ring, weren't you?" Gollum's expression twisted into something dark. "That hobbit is always watching, always suspicious," he spat. "Master trusts Smeagol. Master needs Smeagol." Sam stepped forward, fists clenched. "I've had enough of you, you filthy snake. If you try anything, I swear I'll—" But before Sam could finish, Gollum let out a low, gurgling snarl and lunged. They tumbled together, rolling on the rocky ground, grappling for control. Sam managed to throw Gollum off, sending him sprawling, but the creature was fast, leaping back onto all fours and circling him, hissing. Frodo woke with a start. "Sam, stop." Sam, panting, turned to look at him. Mr. Frodo, he was about to, but Frodo raised a trembling hand. His eyes were tired, sunken, filled with something unreadable. "We need him." Sam stared at Frodo, heart sinking. Gollum was dangerous. He had led them to Shelob. He had tried to take the ring. And yet, Frodo still saw something in him worth saving. Gollum, sensing Frodo's hesitation, changed his tone immediately. "Master is kind, yes. Master understands. Poor Smeagol only wishes to help." Sam turned away, frustration boiling inside him. He could feel something slipping between him and Frodo, something neither of them could stop. They continued forward, though the air between them was heavy with tension. Gollum led them down into a valley, deeper into Mordor. The ground became soft and ashen, the very earth beneath their feet feeling sickly, drained of all life. The great volcano loomed larger now, its fiery glow painting the landscape in eerie hues of red and orange. Then, just as they reached the base of a great ridge, Gollum stopped. He hunched low, sniffing the air. His body tensed and his head darted side to side. "What is it?" Frodo whispered. Gollum turned, his face filled with sudden panic. "We must go back. No, not this way. They will see, they will hear. They are coming." Sam's stomach twisted. "Who's coming?" Before Gollum could answer, a deep, guttural sound echoed through the air, the heavy march of boots, the clatter of weapons. The ground trembled slightly beneath them. Frodo and Sam scrambled to a nearby outcropping of rock, pressing themselves against the stone. Sam peeked over the edge, and his blood went cold. A massive orc battalion was marching toward them. Hundreds of orcs, armored and armed, moving in formation. These were not the mindless rabble of Cirith Ungol, but hardened warriors of Mordor, disciplined and strong. Among them marched several enormous trolls, their hulking bodies covered in thick plates of black iron. And leading them at the front of the column was a massive orc captain, clad in dark armor, his face cruel and scarred. His voice boomed as he barked orders, and the entire company moved with terrifying precision. Sam ducked back down, heart racing. They were trapped. If they moved, they would be seen. If they stayed, they would be caught. Gollum, crouching beside them, was shaking. "They are going to the tower, yes, he whispered. "But they will see us if we move. We must wait. Frodo clutched the ring beneath his shirt, his breath shallow. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. Sam knew one thing: if they were spotted, it would all be over. And so, they waited, holding their breath, as the army of Mordor passed just beneath them, each footstep bringing them closer to their final, desperate journey toward Mount Doom. Frodo, Sam, and Gollum crouched motionless as the great orc battalion marched past below. The air was thick with the stench of iron and sweat. The rhythmic pounding of boots against the earth rattling through the stone where they hid. Each breath was measured, each movement cautious. The sight of so many enemies, so close, made Sam's fingers twitch toward the hilt of his sword. But he knew a fight here would be suicide. Minutes passed like hours, but at last, the army began to disappear into the shadows of Mordor's vast wasteland. When the sound of marching had faded to a distant echo, Gollum twitched his head in quick, erratic movements, sniffing the air. Safe now, yes. But not for long. No, must move quickly. Frodo, pale and shaking, forced himself to his feet. His limbs ached, his body drained beyond exhaustion, but the fire of Mount Doom was closer now. Even in the thick, choking air of Mordor, he could feel its heat pressing against his skin. Sam steadied him. "Can you keep going, Mr. Frodo?" he asked gently. Frodo nodded, though his eyes were distant. The ring's weight had become unbearable. He clutched it against his chest, feeling its pull stronger than ever. Every step forward was a battle against the whispers that filled his mind, urging him to turn back, to claim the ring as his own. They moved onward, slipping through the barren, broken land. There was no cover here, no forests or hills to hide behind, only stretches of cracked earth and jagged rock. Overhead, the sky was smeared with thick clouds of smoke, and the very air seemed to sap their strength. Gollum led them along winding paths, ever cautious of patrolling orcs. More than once, they were forced to drop flat as a scout passed nearby, their armor clinking, their cruel voices carried on the wind. But luck was on their side, and soon they reached a great stretch of barren land leading directly toward Mount Doom. Frodo wavered on his feet, staring up at the massive volcano. The mountain loomed over them, its fiery summit spewing streams of smoke into the sky. He could feel the heat from here, a constant reminder of the terrible task that lay ahead. "We're close," he whispered. Sam tightened his grip on his sword. "Aye, but it won't be easy." Gollum had grown quieter, his movements tense, his large eyes fixed on Frodo with an unreadable hunger. He lagged behind more often, his fingers twitching as he muttered to himself. Sam didn't like it. They made their way across the rough terrain, but the closer they came to the mountain, the harder each step became. Frodo struggled to move, his body weighed down as if he carried not just the ring, but the very mountain itself. Sam took his arm, supporting him, and all the while, Gollum watched. As night fell, they found a small hollow beneath an overhanging rock and collapsed in exhaustion. Frodo lay back, staring up at the swirling sky, his mind fogged with fatigue. Sam sat beside him, rubbing his aching legs, keeping a wary eye on Gollum. It was then that Gollum made his move. With a sudden, desperate lunge, he threw himself at Frodo, his bony hands clawing for the chain around his neck. "Give it to us. Give it back," he screeched. Frodo cried out, struggling against Gollum's wiry strength. Sam leapt to his feet, fury surging through him. "You filthy sneak," he roared, tackling Gollum and throwing him off Frodo. They tumbled over the rocky ground, Sam striking out with his fists. Gollum clawed and bit, snarling like an animal. Sam's rage boiled over. He grabbed Gollum by the throat and slammed him against a rock. "That's the last time you lay hands on him," he growled. Gollum whimpered, his eyes wide with fear. "No, don't hurt us. Poor Smeagol only wants the precious." Sam's grip tightened. He could end it here, end the threat. But then, from behind him, Frodo's voice weak, trembling. "Sam, let him go." Sam hesitated, his heart pounding. "He's nothing now," Frodo whispered. "He doesn't matter anymore." Slowly, reluctantly, Sam loosened his grip and shoved Gollum away. The creature scrambled back, gasping, rubbing his throat. Gollum looked up at Frodo, something dark and desperate in his eyes. But he didn't attack again. He only slinked back into the shadows, staring at them from a distance, his entire body trembling. Sam turned to Frodo. "Mr. Frodo, he's going to try again. You know that, don't you?" Frodo, still clutching the ring, nodded slowly. "Yes, I know." The weight of that knowledge pressed down on both of them. There would be no reasoning with Gollum now. He would never stop trying to reclaim the ring. The path to Mount Doom was before them. The end was near. But Sam knew, in his heart, that the worst was yet to come. The fires of Mount Doom raged in the distance, an ever-burning beacon of destruction against the shadowed sky. The weight of the ring had nearly broken Frodo. Every step forward was a battle, every breath a struggle against its will. It whispered to him now, more than ever, a ceaseless call that tempted him with power, with release from pain. And yet, despite the unbearable burden, he pressed on with Sam at his side, unwavering in his loyalty. They moved slowly, inching toward the heart of Mordor, but they were not alone. Gollum lurked behind them, his body hunched low. his pale skin almost blending into the desolate rock. His obsession with the ring had consumed him completely. Sam had no doubts Gollum would strike again. And soon, before them stretched the final path, a treacherous, winding road leading to the very foot of the mountain. They moved cautiously, knowing that discovery now would mean certain doom. But even as they crept forward, fate conspired against them. From the east, a column of orcs emerged, moving swiftly, their armor glinting dully under the dim, blood-red sky. They were too many, too close. There was nowhere to run. Sam barely had time to react before he and Frodo were spotted. A guttural cry rang out, and in an instant, the orcs were upon them. Frodo, too weak to resist, was seized by rough hands. Sam fought back, but he was no match for their numbers. The orcs laughed as they bound the two hobbits and dragged them toward a looming fortress, Cirith Ungol. The cold stone walls of the tower rose high into the choking air, a place of suffering and cruelty. The orcs threw them inside, shoving Frodo into a separate chamber while they argued amongst themselves. Sam, struggling against his restraints, watched helplessly as the heavy door slammed shut between them. For the first time since their journey began, Frodo and Sam were separated. The hours that followed were a blur of darkness and despair. Sam, left alone in the lower levels of the fortress, could hear the orcs shouting, arguing, fighting. Tension filled the air, and soon enough, it erupted into chaos. The orcs turned on each other, their bickering escalating into bloodshed. Sam, waiting for his chance, slipped free of his bindings and crept through the corridors, his sword clenched tight in his hands. He fought his way upward, striking down any orc that blocked his path. His only thought was of Frodo. Nothing else mattered. At last, he reached the highest chamber and burst inside. Frodo lay on the floor, stripped of his cloak and armor, his body weak and trembling. His eyes fluttered open at the sound of Sam's voice. "Mr. Frodo, I'm here. Frodo looked up, relief washing over his face. Sam. Sam rushed to his side, helping him sit up. "We've got to move, sir. Can you stand?" Frodo nodded weakly. But as he rose, panic flickered across his face. He clutched at his neck, his breath coming in short gasps. "The ring," he whispered. "They took it." Sam's stomach turned to ice. The ring. It was gone. Panic threatened to consume them both, but there was no time to grieve. Sam dragged Frodo to his feet, and together they fled down the spiraling tower. The fortress was in ruin, the orcs having slaughtered each other in their greed. And there, amidst the bodies, Sam's keen eyes spotted something, a glint of gold. He ran forward, heart pounding, and snatched it up. The ring. For the briefest moment, it lay in his palm, heavy and terrible. The thought crossed his mind, what if he kept it? What if he, Samwise Gamgee, bore the burden instead? But then he looked at Frodo, at his pale, suffering face. He didn't hesitate. "Here, Mr. Frodo," he said, pressing the ring into his friend's trembling hands. "It's yours." Frodo clutched it tightly, his breath hitching as he slid it back onto its chain. His eyes met Sam's, filled with gratitude, with pain, with something unspoken. Together, they escaped into the night. The road ahead was darker than ever. Mordor stretched before them, its land barren and broken. Their path led only forward toward Mount Doom, toward the end of all things. And behind them, unseen and silent, Gollum followed. The impact of the Two Towers, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Two Towers is a novel of transition, of struggle, of the ever-deepening darkness before the dawn. It expands upon the world introduced in the Fellowship of the Ring, raising the stakes, delving into the complexities of its characters, and pushing them to their limits. The split narrative structure allows for a sweeping view of Middle-earth, from the grand battles of Rohan to the lonely, treacherous path of Frodo and Sam. The book's influence on fantasy literature and popular culture is immeasurable. It introduced some of the most iconic moments in the Lord of the Rings saga: the Battle of Helm's Deep, the corruption of Isengard, the torment of Gollum. Its themes of perseverance, friendship, and the corrupting nature of power continue to resonate with readers across generations. As the middle chapter of Tolkien's masterpiece, The Two Towers leaves its characters on the precipice of fate. The war for Middle-earth has begun, and the journey toward Mount Doom is nearing its end. With the stakes higher than ever, all roads now lead to the final battle, the last stand against the darkness that threatens to consume the world. And so, the journey continues into the return of the king.